Welcome to the Need to Know podcast from the Wilson Center, a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Always informative, nonpartisan, and relevant, we go beyond the headlines to understand the trend lines in foreign policy. Welcome back to another episode of Need to Know. I'm your host, John Milewski. Need to Know is a podcast produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The center is congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. Need to Know is a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Well, far-right populist movements have been making steady gains in recent elections across Europe. While not all are the same, and their popularity varies from country to country, the spirit of these movements is encapsulated through a poster from Austria's Freedom Party. It says, in part, "Stop EU chaos, asylum crisis, climate terror, and warmongering." To help us understand what's happening, my guest is Robin Quinville, director of the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. Robin, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Robin, let's start with a case study. What happened in France when Macron called for snap elections, what was seen as quite a gamble. Did it pay off, and has Le Pen and her Nationalist Party peaked in its popularity?
You know, I don't think that this was a safe gamble at all, right? In the end, Macron has been able to come through, but it strikes me that it has really been a case of showing the strength of the right, even though it is, you could not say they have now won the election, right? So I thought it was a very big gamble for Macron to do this, and I'm not sure that it had the result that he would have intended.
Mm-hmm. So, Robin, let's step back from the individual races and what's happening, and what are the concerns writ large, as in general across Europe, and how much of this movement is about migration singularly?
There are a lot of factors that play into this, and they're a little bit different in every country. Migration is certainly a factor, though, because, of course, it started with the migration in 2015, where we saw a large number of refugees coming from the Syria conflict. And Europe absorbed a lot of these refugees, and that had a different impact in various countries. But it raised the issue to a level that was really very prominent in so many parts of Europe. So that was one factor. But there have also been economic shifts and others that have given rise to some populist movements across Europe. So, for example, you had the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany is its name, started off as a party that was against the euro, the currency, right? And that was, it started in 2013. It's not that old, but in 2015 with the migration crisis, it absorbed that resentment. And now, as you're seeing economic results from COVID and others, there is that skepticism of mainstream parties that rises. And I think that is actually a factor across Europe. In times of economic uncertainty, they are able to.
And talk to us about what the concerns are for people who aren't part of that movement.
For people who are not in AfD, yeah, they look at this and they think, okay, where is my economic certainty? How am I going to be able to rise in the economic sphere? How am I going to be able to ensure that my job is certain? How am I going to have a better life? Because this is part of it. And the concerns about migration are, in times of economic crisis, of uncertainty, how does migration affect that for me? And sometimes resentment of migration is actually large in places where there are the fewest migrants.
So for those who view, often the reporting or the dialogue about this it views the rise of the right as a threat. That somehow there are things that, for instance, perhaps support for Ukraine could falter because of a populist movement. Talk to me about those types of concerns and whether or not they've borne out, where we've seen, for instance, in Italy, Prime Minister Meloni has actually been very strong on statements about support for Ukraine. So talk to us a bit about what the concerns have been about the rise of far-right populism and what we've actually seen in practice.
So I'm going to talk about a little bit about far right populism, but I also then want to come to something where we see the rise of a far left party. So, all right, because on the far right, okay, they have played off of fears of migration. They are expressing concerns about economic certitude and the economic future, and what the swap out from on energy has meant, because the war in Ukraine is not just, in their minds, the war in Ukraine, it's what have been the economic consequences for countries and budgets, and how is that affecting people. The prices of energy have risen enormously. They are coming back, but it's still much more than they had expected. And they look at this and they see that part of that has to do with the fact that that many countries have stopped importing energy sources from Russia. And there are others who say, look at the inflation overall. Can we live with this? With Ukraine, it's meant an increase in defense spending and providing defense equipment to Ukraine. What does that mean for them at home? And so particularly in areas which are economically disadvantaged, this seems to reinforce the sense that, wait a minute, what is happening and how does this affect us? And in Germany, we've just had elections in 3 of the East German states. And in those states, it's not just the rise of the far-right party, the Alternative for Germany, that has been notable, but the rise of a brand new far-left party headed by Sarah Wagenknecht. She used to be a member of the party that was called the Left. It's the successor to the old East German Communist Party. But she left that and formed her own movement, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance. And I'm going to give it an abbreviation, BSW. And that polled in the 13% range in these states. And it's only been founded this year. It's very rare to have a party that is the name of the party founder, and there's a lot of skepticism about that in many parts of Germany. But she was able to draw on a sort of leftist economic approach and bundle into that the skepticism about the war in Ukraine, and to try and put herself forward as a proponent of peace with Russia. And so you're seeing a rise there of populism, not only on the right, but also on the left. And that is
Does that speak to just growing partisanship or the kind of divide that we've seen in the United States and elsewhere? Are we seeing just the extremes kind of polarizing in a way where, there's the middle is being squeezed out?
John, I think you've really hit the nail on the head with this, because you are seeing this, and this actually goes Europe-wide, that there is increasing polarization for sure, and that's a phenomenon that we have seen in so many places. But there's also that skepticism of the traditional parties. Remember that in places like Germany, every government is a coalition government, right? So you have to be able to put a bunch of parties together in order to govern. At the federal level in Germany, that's 3 parties that are governing together right now. And yet, what you see is a kind of pulling away from those established parties, and a willingness to consider parties that are more on the fringe, like the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, that push up against the established positions, right? Because those established parties have had to make a lot of compromises in order to build coalitions over the years, and so people wonder what is their record, and that then leads to what is the strength of democracy in terms when you are looking at that? Are people willing to consider something that might be due to skepticism about the efficacy of democracy?
Yeah, no longer a part of the EU, but obviously still part of Europe. England, the UK, the Labour Party, with historic success in the last elections, adopting what many have described as a centrist approach. Why has that not been as fruitful in other parts of Europe as it proved to be in the UK?
And part of that has to do with the nature of the UK's electoral system, its first past the post voting system. But also, I think it's worth remembering that in this election this year, you had a incumbent government that had had 14 years in government. And those had been some difficult years, and that had included Brexit, and that included COVID, and it included several prime ministers over that time. And I think that there was a sense that people were looking for a change from that party. And in the UK, there's much less of a possibility for a new party to make a dent, although Nigel Farage's party did actually get seats in Parliament, so that is new. But it looked in these elections like people were ready for a change, and the centrist approach of the Labour Party in that way meant that folks that had been voting for the Tory party could consider that this is a party that was perhaps better suited to their interests.
A final thought about Ursula von der Leyen beginning a new term in the EU commissioner, and does her job get considerably more difficult as a result of these elections? How will the center, not the center hold, but how will the EU hold up to this changing landscape?
Well, the EU had parliamentary elections in June, and so you saw some of these early trends as people were choosing their parliamentarians. Ursula von der Leyen, I think, has one of the hardest jobs in Europe, and frankly, she's got to constantly be negotiating with the representatives of all of these countries. At the same time, I think that it is possible for her to do that kind of negotiating and to bring these folks together on certain lines, but it's going to be involving a lot more dialogue, particularly with countries as they are trying to take these things into account. The good news, I think, is that dialogue is what it is all about. There are some shared concerns. I think that they will be able to reach agreement. But one of the strengths of consensus is, in fact, that if you can gain it, then you can go, right? Yeah. And so the gaining of that, yes, you may not get what you originally set out to get, but you will get something that you are able to actually fully implement. And so that is what.
So once we can herd the cats, we can get the cats to do something together.
Yeah, that's right. It is a very difficult job to try and move this forward. At the same time, you're looking at different threat perceptions, different interests, and so forth. But the EU, in and of itself, as an entity, has agreed that it is stronger together, and it's just a question of how you can deploy those strengths.
Well, thank you, Robin. And for those of you interested in learning more, you can visit wilsoncenter.org. If you use the Programs tab at the top of the homepage, you can visit the Wilson Center's Global Europe program and see all the great work from Robin and her colleagues. We'll be back with another episode of Need to Know soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Milewski. Thank you for your time and interest.